Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this lecture by Professor Alison Jones from King's College London. And this is actually the inaugural lecture of the HKU Competition Law Lecture Series. We are starting a lecture series in competition law this year, and Professor Jones will be the first of a series of speakers who will come to speak at HKU this year. So if you're interested in competition law, I encourage you to stay tuned. And I can think of no other person to inaugurate this lecture series than Professor Alison Jones. For those of you who are students of competition law, especially students of EU competition law, you will no doubt be familiar with this book. This is not the latest edition because the latest edition sits in my home where I work. This is the 6th edition, but she's of course one of the authors of the leading text on EU competition law text cases and materials. And Professor Jones teaches and researches in the sphere of competition law. I guess that goes without saying. She is truly one of the titans in EU competition law. And in addition to this very, very valuable and exhaustive and comprehensive text, she has also published this work on corruption and in public procurement and competition, and which her lecture will be based on today. And she's also published numerous papers in leading academic and specialist competition law journals and a number of edited collections. And of course, she has won, her research has won the Concurrence Antitrust Writing Awards. And she's also been prepared expert reports for the European Commission, the UK government, and even across the Atlantic for the US House Committee of the Judiciary, Subcommittee on Antitrust, Commercial, and Administrative Law. There is really no bigger expert on EU competition law than Professor Jones, and please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you very much for that extremely kind introduction. So as Thomas has said, my research is principally focused on competition law and especially EU competition law. But today I'm going to focus my remarks on the topic of combating collusion and corruption in public procurement markets, the subject matter of the recent monograph that Thomas has just mentioned, and I co-authored with Rob Anderson and Bill Kovacic. So as the title suggests, I'm going to touch on 3 distinct areas of law. So not only the competition law and policy towards cartels that involve the rigging of bids for public tenders, but also the laws which seek to control corruption in this context where public officials improperly steer public contracts to favoured bidders, either in return for benefits or as a result of favoritism. And also corruption and collusion control in public procurement systems, the systems which govern the purchasing with public money of goods, services, works, and infrastructure. So what I want to do over the next 30 or 40 minutes or so is to try and do 3 things. First of all, to highlight the importance of the topic of combating collusion and corruption in public procurement, and why I think it should be a priority for governments, policymakers, and relevant agencies, despite the numerous other challenges they have to address. I also want to examine, why, despite significant efforts that have already been taken by many governments across the world to protect public procurement processes from these 2 practices, these conventional efforts and steps may not be working as well as they should be. And then to discuss a variety of different proposals or measures that can be adopted to try and make a public procurement system more resilient to corrupt and collusive practices through bolstering and improving existing regimes, and in particular ensuring that relevant agencies work together to develop a pro-competitive procurement system. So although I'm going to discuss the types of problems that frequently occur in different jurisdictions across the globe and make some general proposals for reform, the specific measures to achieve change in any jurisdiction will, of course, depend on a careful diagnosis of the problems arriving in that particular system and targeted steps to try and address and overcome those problems. So by way of example, I will say a few words about the position in the UK, reflect on the problems that might be occurring there and how weaknesses in its system might be addressed. So turning to the first question, why should combating collusion and corruption in public procurement be a priority, and why do I think this topic matters? Well, at the core, because what is at stake here is huge sums of public money and goods, services, works and infrastructure that are central to economic and social development and to the economy and citizens. So every year, governments around the world spend vast quantities of money on the purchase of, for example, roads, bridges, airports, energy grids, sewer systems, and medical health and defence facilities. For many countries, this spending amounts to around 30% of all government spending and billions of dollars. So, for example, in the UK, a recent House of Commons research briefing estimated that in 2021 to 2022, spending on public procurement amounted to £329 billion, representing about 1/3 of all public sector spending in the UK. So if public procurement is done well, scarce public resources can be saved and their benefit maximised. And a government can provide its citizens with more and better public goods and services at the same time as nurturing competition and innovation in markets and instilling confidence in itself. In contrast, if public procurement processes are distorted by collusion or corruption, the converse will be true. The quality and quantity of public goods and services will be reduced, and precious taxpayer money will be squandered and improperly diverted. And this in turn breeds frustration amongst citizens about misuse of public money and mistrust in government and its institutions. Indeed, an extensive body of reports and academic literature highlight the significant financial costs of these practices, but also more broadly, their negative impact on economic growth, human development, poverty reduction, national security, and more generally, citizen satisfaction with life. So the negative effects of cartels in this area may therefore impact the wider economy even more significantly than other cartel activity. A serious problem, therefore, is that not only are public procurement processes difficult to manage well, but they are inherently vulnerable to both collusive and corrupt practices because they provide both opportunities for these practices to occur and alluring incentives for it to take place. And in some cases, you find examples of collusion and corruption operating together, reinforcing one another and making each other more stable. So, for example, certain features of public procurement processes, such as their regular nature, their value, volume, and the conditions under which they take place, may make it easier for firms to align their behaviour and to conclude a bid rigging agreement. They may also facilitate the rapid identification of internal deviations and external threats to any collusive equilibrium, meaning that cartelists can react quickly to them and counter those threats. A further complication is that procurement officials who are in the best position to identify and detect bid rigging practices may not be incentivized to do so if, in so doing, it will disrupt the completion of the process, the public procurement processes, that they are employed to conduct. As already indicated, procurers may even in some situations, in return for a reward, be drawn into and form part of the collusive scheme, so bolstering its operation and stability. In fact, public procurement processes managed not by their intended beneficiaries, nor by those providing the funds, constitute one of the highest corruption risk activities, given the large value of contracts often involved, the close relationships that often get forged between procurers and businesses operating on the market, and the difficulty of sort of detecting improper conduct in this area. So as a result, individuals may face huge temptations to exploit their office in return for personal partisan benefits, such as bribes. And in some of the cases uncovered, those bribes represent a fixed percentage of the value of the contracts at issue. But holidays, offers of subsequent employment, or even in some cases, political donations. Companies also face strong temptations to pay bribes or to rig bids, as by doing so, they stand to make enhanced profits from winning these lucrative large-scale procurement contracts. So I've put some examples on the side of the slide of some instances of corruption and collusion that have occurred in cases over the world. The first one involves an extraordinary case in Brazil, uncovered by Operation Car Wash, although I should say that there are still some appeals and some of these cases have been overturned for procedural and on due process grounds. But one senior official found to be involved in the operation agreed in a plea deal to return nearly $97 million of that had been received in bribes. And the huge construction company at the center of the bid rigging and allegedly at the center of the bid rigging and bribery scheme, Odebrecht, was found in US Foreign Corrupt Proceedings Act to have paid 788 million in bribes. And as a result, it had been able to earn significant profits from the contracts that it was awarded through this combined bid rigging and bribery scheme. I've also put an example on a smaller scale, but of an MOD official who's recently found to have commissioned a small number of contracts, and he was awarded 10% of the value of each of those contracts, and that amounted to £70,000. So the opportunities are there and relatively strong incentives. So the central significance of public procurement and the need to shield it from both corrupt and collusive practices is well known. It's not something new. In fact, widespread debate, numerous international initiatives, and academic commentary has led to some consensus around the question of how to construct a robust legal system to fight these practices, and the adoption or reform of many national laws to reflect this consensus. So many jurisdictions, including all of the ones that we examined in detail in our book, have developed relatively sophisticated public procurement regimes designed to minimize opportunities for corruption and collusion, and providing as the norm for fair, transparent, open, and competitive public procurement processes. They also have competition and anti-corruption laws in place that prohibit bid rigging and bribery, incorporate stringent penalties for infringing those rules, and provide for effective enforcement mechanisms. And because many of these have been influenced by the same international initiatives, many of them have similarities and recognise the need for an integrated approach in this area. But are they working? And that's one of the questions we try to consider in our book. Of course, it's very difficult to estimate and measure the volume of collusion or corruption that occurs in any jurisdiction because these practices tend to be committed in secret and hidden. But our book, after examining a number of jurisdictions and literature, echoes the concerns raised by many commentators that the international and national efforts that I've just described to combat these practices have produced rather limited and perhaps rather disappointed results, even in advanced industrial, generally well-governed or relatively clean economies, and even in times of national crisis. And we'll come on to some of those. We'll have a look at the UK in a moment. In some jurisdictions, examples of both practices seem to be exposed by law enforcement agencies with depressing regularity despite these stringent rules against them. In others, reports and indices paint a picture which suggests that all may not be well and that collusion and corruption may in fact be occurring quite regularly in public procurement markets, and that the actual cases that have been exposed in a particular jurisdiction may just be the tip of the iceberg, with many other incidents of these practices hiding beneath the waterline. So that indicates that rather perhaps than giving up in the face of these newly invigorated laws, it may be that the attractive incentives that we've just discussed and that encourage wrongdoing in this area may simply mean that the companies and individuals involved in wrongdoing have adapted and have been able to exploit weaknesses within the kind of new or reformed systems adopted. So what might those weaknesses be? They could derive from gaps in the law, or other flaws within the system. Of course, the success of any regime depends not just on good laws, but also on political commitment to them and their effective application, interpretation, implementation, and enforcement. So it may be possible, for example, that the public procurement regimes are, despite their objectives, still leaving the door open or ajar to collusion and corruption. Fair, open, transparent, and competitive processes may not always be happening as frequently as they should be, perhaps because, for example, poorly defined exclusions or overly broad derogations to the rules exist, or the processes themselves incorporate stringent bidding criteria or technical specifications which restrict the pool of bidders and therefore suppress rather than stimulate competition and make it easier for these practices to occur. Or perhaps because procurers are inadequately trained or lack the resources to carry out their remit, or there's weak oversight of processes. Also, competition and anti-corruption laws may have gaps, or they may not be having the deterrent effect intended if either detection levels of violations are low or penalties for infringements are insufficiently dissuasive. Incentives for law breaking will remain if the expected benefits from wrongdoing outweigh the likely costs of it. The existence of low levels of detection and prosecution of this conduct is not entirely surprising, given the complexities involved in uncovering and prosecuting these types of practices and the pressure on competition and anti-corruption agencies to deal with an ever broader set of concerns. So, for example, in the competition law context, agencies are having to manage an expanding set of challenges, that include, for example, dealing with new practices and increasing consolidation and concentration in some markets, especially in the digital economy. They're dealing with concerns in many jurisdictions about exploitation of customers and consumers, and how thinking about how competition law may support other public policy objectives such as sustainability. So they've a lot to manage. And in the anti-corruption context, it may be that law enforcers have to choose between trying to investigate these types of very complex economic crime or focusing their limited resources on other serious crimes. And an additional problem may be that despite significant efforts to integrate policies, regimes may still remain relatively siloed with insufficient coordination between the three kind of sets of agencies or institutions. So where these types of problems exist, further steps may be required to strengthen and the operation and working of these regimes. So how could that happen? So to bolster a regime, measures may be necessary to enable the public procurement, competition and anti-corruption laws to work better, both in themselves, individually, and also together. And these kind of reforms or measures should be focused not just on deterring collusion and corruption, which, as we've discussed already, is difficult and costly, but also on making renewed efforts to prevent the conduct from happening in the first place. So collusion and corruption opportunities could be reduced in public procurement processes, for example, by making sure that competitive bidding is the norm and that derogations from such processes are clearly articulated and limited. Through increased efforts to ensure professionalization of the workforce so that they have not only the capacity, but also the capability to perform their job. They're properly trained in the skills that are required to carry it out. Developing anti-corruption organizational cultures within institutions and ensuring codes of conduct and registers of conflicts of interest are in place, and considering a range of other measures to strengthen the integrity of the system as a whole. For example, the fine-tuning of appropriate and proportionate rules which permit the exclusion of firms that represent a risk to the public procurement processes from participating within them. So those are often referred to or as rules governing exclusion or debarment of companies. Enhancing oversight procedures, requiring tenderers to sign certificates of independent bidding, saying that they have prepared their bids independently and not in coordination with another firm that's bidding in the market. And ensuring that a meaningful appeals or review system is in place, which allows interested parties to challenge improperly conducted public procurement processes. At the same time, a number of measures can be taken to improve the working of the competition and anti-corruption regimes, so as to increase their deterrent effect and to ensure that relevant players on the market cannot act with impunity. This could be done, for example, by reviewing the laws to identify any gaps within them, but also ensuring or encouraging agencies to prioritize enforcement in this area and make full use of their detection methods and powers to impose sanctions. So, for example, in the competition sphere, leniency schemes where firms come forward and self-report that they've been involved in illegal cartel activity have become important and quite successful mechanisms in some jurisdictions which are relied on by agencies for inducing the provision of evidence, especially first evidence of an offence. But there's a growing view that they have their limits and they shouldn't be over-relied on. So agencies should therefore, as well as developing their own proactive detection techniques, also think how they can collect evidence from a broader range of sources, including in particular the public procurement officials themselves, who are in the best place to detect it, but also other agencies, perhaps cross-referrals of case from other agencies, employees, or other informants capable of delivering credible evidence. And if they do use these broader sets of tools, they may not only uncover evidence of conduct that might otherwise remain hidden or stable under a standalone leniency regime, but they may also increase the effectiveness of the leniency regime by increasing the risk, of course, of the conduct being uncovered, even if it's not self-reported. In addition, some jurisdictions are quite heavily reliant on corporate fines to sanction infringements of competition law. A difficulty with this, though, is that even if those fines are very high, and they are extremely high in many jurisdictions, they may not be able to be high enough to deter what we've seen can be very highly profitable behaviour. So consequently, to concentrate the mind of those involved, it may be that there is a need also to ensure that sanctions are available and can be imposed on individuals that have actually been involved in the misconduct. And there is a possibility perhaps that the infringing companies will not only be fined, but will be excluded or debarred from future public procurement processes, which will have a further impact on those companies. And this would at the same time make it clear to companies that access to these public contracts depends on their genuine efforts to secure compliance with the law. And finally, it seems clear that in many jurisdictions, more can be done to try and ensure that taxpayer money is recovered where wrongdoing has occurred. For example, where bid rigging for public tenders has been uncovered, that then the government or the relevant agency should routinely bring a damages action to recover compensation in respect of the overpayments that they've made for the contract that was tainted by the bid rigging process. So a kind of range of suggestions of how to bolster each of the regimes individually. But coordination between the agencies and institutions will help to achieve and deliver these changes. So, for example, a competition authority may, in addition to improving its own enforcement efforts, can try to work with governments through sort of advocacy to ensure that exclusions or derogations from public procurement rules which provide for competitive tendering are kept to an absolute minimum. They can also encourage the government to put in place compulsory competition law training programs for procurers, and to develop mechanisms for clawing back taxpayer money when bid rigging for public tenders is uncovered. They can also work with procurement officials and institutions, training them on the benefits of competitive tendering, how to design tenders in a way to reduce the risk of collusion, and how, to look for red flags that collusion might be happening in any bid rigging process, and where they see it, to report it to the competition authority. It could also encourage the public procurement institutions to put in place incentives to encourage reporting of bid rigging by their officers, because we've seen that one of the problems that exists is that they may not be incentivized to do that because actually all it will do is disrupt the process that they're supposed to be getting done. Competition authorities could also work closely in this area with anti-corruption agencies to ensure that they have a mutual understanding of each other's remit. This is important here because if corruption and collusion are working together, the competition authority might be interested in the bid rigging, but have no mandate or ability to deal with the bribery. So they could work closely with other agencies so that they understand what the laws that the others are trying to enforce, and that they can work together to achieve their sort of shared goals and objectives and exchange information and work positively together to fight these types of conduct. And finally, the competition agency can work closely with businesses to raise awareness of the laws and to encourage them in various different ways to ensure compliance with them. So those with the kind of the general proposals. So I just now could spend a few minutes looking at the position in the UK as an example of a more concrete example of the problems that we perceive to be happening there. And I'm going to focus my comments on England and Wales, simply because the rules are a little bit different in the other jurisdictions, and especially in Scotland, which has its own somewhat different laws. So in the UK, a commonly held view is we don't really need to be too worried about this kind of problem. We're a relatively clean economy where spending is protected by comprehensive public procurement, competition and anti-corruption laws, and where relatively few cases of this type of wrongdoing impacting on domestic procurement processes have been uncovered. But is this view justified? Well, it's true that the components of a very comprehensive regime are in place. First, both the current and soon to be adopted new public procurement laws aim to ensure that public procurement achieves value for money and avoids favoritism. They provide for competitive tendering processes in the norm, and they incorporate a range of other measures which are designed to ensure the smooth operation and that the integrity of the system is protected, for example, through ensuring the publication of information relating to processes, provisions for the disregarding of bids from excluded suppliers that represent a risk to the process, and providing review procedures that allow challenges to processes by disappointed bidders. In the competition law sphere, we have both a civil and criminal offence for cartel activity. So the civil offence is set out in the Competition Act 1998, and that act prohibits undertakings, that is, entities engaged in economic activity, companies, etc., from concluding cartels, including bid rigging arrangements. It's enforced publicly, principally by the UK Competition Authority, the Competition and Markets Authority, or the CMA, which can impose fines when it finds an infringement has occurred during its own administrative procedure. So it follows an administrative rather than a judicial model. It can also seek a disqualification order against company directors that have been involved in a violation, and the Competition Act can also be enforced privately by those affected or injured by a violation. Then we have a separate criminal cartel offence, which was introduced in 2002, a few years later, with the specific objective of increasing deterrence to cartel activity. It can be prosecuted by our competition authority, the CMA, or by another anti-fraud department called the Serious Fraud Office, and that it can result in imprisonment of individuals for up to 5 years and the imposition of unlimited fines on those individuals. The UK also has stringent anti-corruption laws. So the Bribery Act, which was adopted in 2010, overhauled a patchwork of anti-corruption laws that had been developed and introduced laws criminalising both active and passive bribery, so the payment or the receipts of bribes, and also bribery of foreign public officials, so foreign bribery. Because of the difficulties involved in finding corporations liable in criminal cases, so it applies to corporations and individuals, the Act also introduced a strict liability offence for corporations that fail to prevent bribery, unless they can establish that they have adequate procedures in place to prevent it. And the Bribery Act can be prosecuted by the Serious Fraud Office, which also has jurisdiction to enforce the criminal cartel offence, or the Director of Public Prosecutions, the DPP. It's also true that few cases, we've got strong regimes in place. It's also true that few cases of collusion or corruption impacting on public procurement in domestic public procurement have been exposed. But nonetheless, and this is what I was talking about earlier, a range of government and other reports. So I've got references to Cabinet Office, House of Commons Account Committee, Transparency International, Housing Ministries. Surveys suggest that these practices could be occurring more frequently than the number of decided cases suggest. So it's possible that, as I've already described, that these reports and indices are painting a picture which is suggesting that we do have more of these cases hidden under the waterline. In addition, the Serious Fraud Office has uncovered a number of incidences of foreign bribery, so raising the question of whether, if those firms are willing to engage in unethical and unlawful behaviour overseas, might they also be willing to engage in that type of behaviour in the UK? So it seems feasible, therefore, that the mismatch between revealed cases and perceptions could be because, as I've just described, that weaknesses in the system are preventing them from achieving their objectives. Indeed, once you put the system under the microscope, it seems that some of the generic problems that I've just described might exist in the UK. So, for example, in relation to public procurement, there's been concern expressed that insufficient safeguards have been in place for direct awards without competition, especially in emergency purchasing situations. And this particular problem was highlighted quite significantly during the COVID pandemic. There's also concern that there may be insufficient training of procurers and monitoring of processes, and a rather weak anti-corruption organisational culture in some institutions. It's also been unclear how the complex exclusion powers have been used in practice, and there's no legal requirement for certificates of independent bidding by tenderers to be used. Further, given the limited picture of limited enforcement against bid rigging and bribery impacting on public procurement, it could be that the deterrent effect of the cartel and bribery rules is rather low, so they're not achieving their objectives. Although the CMA is now focusing more closely on bid rigging impacting on public procurement. To date, there have only been a handful of civil cases that have been brought by the CMA and where bid rigging has been found impacting on public procurement. And the criminal cartel offence has not really been a success. Criminal convictions, even though this act was introduced in 2002 and came into effect in 2003, have only occurred on a few occasions, and in all cases where the parties involved had pleaded guilty. So they haven't won a contested case. And the CMA now seems to have little appetite to enforce the criminal cartel offence and tends still to rely on its administrative process. A variety of factors potentially seem to be responsible for the paucity of criminal cases. For example, problems with the original drafting of the offence, perhaps because a moral case for criminalisation hasn't really been sufficiently built. And so it's unclear to jurors and judges why this conduct should be criminalised, because procedural difficulties result from the coexistence of the civil and the criminal regimes, and perhaps also because the CMA ordinarily follows an administrative procedure and therefore doesn't have as much criminal law expertise. Similarly, although the Serious Fraud Office has brought a number of foreign bribery cases, it hasn't yet brought a criminal cartel case, and it's brought relatively few prosecutions in which bribery has impacted on domestic public procurement rather than foreign bribery. So all of this suggests that some measures for improving the system, including some of those I've already discussed, should be considered. So although the Procurement Act 2023, which is coming into force early next year, will deal with some of the problems identified in the public procurement sphere. For example, the provisions will guard more effectively against favouritism where direct awards are made and strengthen the exclusion and debarment system. It doesn't provide solutions to all of the problems. So further steps could be taken, for example, to ensure that the public procurement workforce is trained systematically on competition law, to ensure better capture of an analysis of procurement data, to ensure adherence to publication rules, to develop a better counter-fraud and anti-corruption culture in government, to build closer relationships between procurers and law enforcement agencies, and to ensure that certificates of independent bidding are used in all cases. And in addition, to increase the deterrent effect of the competition and anti-corruption laws, enforcement in this area, in my view, should be prioritised. Although the CMA has started to do this in recent years and is focusing closely on this, there is still no specialist investigation unit in England that targets corruption affecting the public sector. And other jurisdictions do have these kinds of units. Agencies could work more closely with businesses to ensure use of compliance programs and take steps to ensure that they are not overly reliant on self-reporting schemes. So many of those things I've mentioned already. The competition agency could work with procurers to encourage their monitoring of processing, consider how to incentivize whistleblowers, and use data screening tools, for example, to monitor markets themselves. I've already mentioned that one problem in the UK in the cartel sphere is that despite its specific goal of increasing deterrence, the criminal cartel offence has largely fallen into abeyance. The UK experience has been that it's not easy to make criminalisation of cartel conduct work effectively. Not only are criminal cartel cases because of the higher standard of proof and more complex wording of the statute more difficult to establish, but it's not easy to persuade juries to convict persons or to persuade courts to imprison offenders. In recent years, the CMA has begun to try and target individuals, but by routinely seeking disqualification orders against company directors when it's enforcing the Competition Act, the civil offence. Thought does seem to be needed, though, to be given to the question of whether to retain this criminal offence, and if so, to try and breathe new life into it. If it is to be retained, arguably one way of generating support for it could be to target prosecutions on bid rigging, which negatively impacts on the purchase of vital public goods and services, or schools and hospitals, that kind of press the point to the jury that these are serious practices which seriously negatively impact the economy and citizens. And such cases are likely to prove quite difficult for those involved to defend if the conduct's been hidden, and if they've been required to and have signed certificates of independent bidding. Further, additional changes to the offence could be considered. Currently, if corruption and collusion were to occur together, then different investigators and prosecutors would need to be involved, and the great care would need to be taken to ensure that one investigation doesn't taint the others, with different procedural powers, etc., and rights of defence applying. Synergies would clearly be unlocked if all elements of bid rigging and bribery could be examined together, and not all jurisdictions have provisions in place that allow that. But if synergies would be unlocked if one authority in the UK could look at all elements of bid rigging and bribery in relation to both corporations and individuals. And one way of enabling this would be to expand the criminal offence, which I know seems strange when we've talked about it not being very successful, but to cover legal persons as well as individuals, and perhaps also to those promoting or abetting bid rigging. Although criminalising cartel behaviour would raise the evidential bar for prosecutors without substantially changing the available sanctions, proceedings against corporations could be facilitated if, in a similar way to the Bribery Act, a separate offence of failure to prevent the conclusion of an unlawful cartel or bid rigging agreement were adopted, albeit subject to a defence that the company had adequate procedures in place to prevent it. If the criminal offence were to be expanded in this way, then consideration would clearly be needed to be given in the UK as to who would lead responsibility for enforcing it. As neither the CMA nor the SFO have yet displayed much enthusiasm for doing so, it may be that another entity, perhaps a newly created police unit targeting corruption affecting the public sector, could be entrusted with the task. It also appears that in England and Wales, as far as I can see, well, there's no reported case of any civil action for damages being lodged by a public procurer that's been a victim of bid rigging. There have been some cases, some civil cases. So there might be room to develop a programme, for example, by entrusting responsibility for recovery of damages on behalf of public procurers to some sort of central government body. Okay, so I am a final word. Although I'm not going to discuss this in detail today, it's a subject matter for another lecture. Our book does recognise that even though this is a difficult and complex issue to resolve for any jurisdiction, the position may become even more difficult and even more complex where corruption is more entrenched or embedded within a system. In this situation, the measures that I've just described are unlikely to work on their own, especially because the corruption may not be occurring simply as a result of the actions of rogue players on the market. Rather, they may be due to a systemic problem in which corruption is expected and anticipated by everyone. So where this is the case, businesses may, for example, feel that they have no choice but to pay a bribe if they are going to win a contract. Now, in these jurisdictions, law enforcement may be difficult, it may not occur, or it may be subverted or face backlashes if tried, meaning that some form of refashioning the law and perhaps also combined with broader political or institutional reform will be required. Reforms, of course, will also be dependent on someone being able and willing to implement those reforms, and they're likely to be strongly resisted by those benefiting from the status quo. So where this is the case, you may need a coalition of national actors supported by international or regional institutions to drive reform and the building of an anti-corruption agenda. And one of the chapters we look at the role that the European Union can play in trying to sort of drive change and reform at the member state level. So that's all I wanted to say. But in conclusion, just to say that corruption and collusion appear to be continuing to plague many jurisdictions and many public procurement systems, despite significant international and national efforts to combat them, and the significant harm that these practices are known to create. It's a challenge to ensure the effectiveness of systems and to make public procurement a less inviting environment for these practices. So many jurisdictions do need to bolster established tools, consider new solutions, and ensure stronger policy coordination, and essentially conduct regular reviews of their processes and laws to fight them.
Thank you very much, Alison, for a very comprehensive and thoughtful lecture on this very important topic. Right. Thank you very much for coming, and please join me in thanking both Professor Alison Jones for giving the lecture today